"I hate these field trips. Always so dang boring," said Red Graham. Red stood with his arm over the back of the pen, fencing in 50 Black Angus cows. His red hair and freckles standing out in the bright midday sun gave reason to his nickname. His real name was Darrell Lewis Graham, but no one called him that except his grandmother. Red shuffled his booted feet in the dusty Oklahoma earth. "At least it gets us out of class, man," Dave Forrester pointed out the obvious to his best friend. "I'd rather be here smelling cow shit than sitting in trig listening to Mr. Jenkins try and explain angles. If you'd bathe once in a while, you wouldn't smell like cow shit, dumbass." Red punched Dave in the arm, laughing. "Shut the hell up, you redneck. If anyone smells here, it's you." Dave covered his nose, trying not to laugh out loud. "What the heck is that stench? You reek." "It's Old Spice." Red pulled his shirt up to his nose and sniffed. "It doesn't stink, dude. It's attractive to the ladies." He ran his hands down his tall, skinny form. "And you know how much the ladies love me." Dave bent over double and gagged. "I think I'm gonna be sick." Red kicked Dave in the butt, sending him flying into the dirt. 3 classmates turned and laughed at their antics. Dave sat up and leaned against the fence. "That was uncool, dude," he said, laughing. "Kiss my ass, Dave." Red walked over and put out his hand to his friend, pulling him up. "Come on, everyone's moving into the barn," said Red. Together they followed the group, bringing up the rear while Dave slapped dust off his backside. "What's in this building?" Dave asked. "It's where they house the cows before they load them in the back of the truck and haul them over to the slaughterhouse. Should be entertaining," Red said with moderate sarcasm. Dave looked around as they entered the large metal structure. The floors were concrete and it smelled like animal feces, industrial-strength cleanser, and hay. The class was standing before an indoor pen containing 11 cows. Mr. Hinkie, their FFA Future Farmers of America teacher, began to speak. "Inside this pen are the next 11 heads of Angus to be taken to McShane's slaughterhouse. Fairhaven Farm delivers about 20 head of cattle a month to slaughter, which isn't much, but since they raise their cattle organically, it's a healthy number for a farm this size. Mostly, Fairhaven makes its money by growing wheat and organic vegetables. They have a sizable farmers market every Saturday. The Angus cattle are just a small percent of their operation." 2 Mexican farmhands entered the pen with cattle prods in hand. A third backed up a flatbed truck to the back of the pen from the opposite side of the barn. As Dave and the rest of the class watched, 2 men began to herd the cattle towards the now open back gate. Red laughed as the shorter farmhand zapped one of the cows on its hindquarters, making it bellow in protest. "Did you see that, man? That cow is already getting fried. Makes me want a burger after this." Red slapped Dave on the shoulder, but he didn't respond. His eyes were drawn to one cow still laying down to the right side of the pen. It was mooing, but not rising. The taller farmhand walked over and started shouting at it. "Subida vaca! Levántese! Prisa!" He pointed the prodder at the cow's side and zapped it. Immediately the cow began to moo in protest, rising on shaky legs. The man kept prodding the cow, whose eyes rolled around in its head, terrified. As it came to a full stand, it became obvious that its back right leg was broken. It hung awkwardly, swinging back and forth as the cow tried not to put the hoof down. You are listening to Harvest, written by Michelle E. Gwynn. This book is narrated by Ron Phillips. This audio recording was produced in 2014 by Pinnacle Studios and Michelle E. Gwynn, which owns the copyright. No portion of this recording may be reproduced for any reason without prior written consent from Pinnacle Studios and Michelle E. Gwynn. From the author. I've always loved the science fiction genre. Nothing cemented that for me more than a frightening UFO sighting on January 6, 1995 in my hometown of Schertz, Texas. It was the middle of the day, around noon, with clear skies. Driving past a row of pastures that are now filled with homes, my mother and I noticed something hovering off to our right. Being near Randolph Air Force Base, we thought it was probably some kind of training aircraft. I turned to look and saw not one, but 2 huge spherical-shaped objects hovering stock still in the sky side by side. They were a silvery color and had no lights, no windows, no visible point of entry, and no visible landing gear. To put it in perspective, they looked like 2 football stadium-sized oval ball bearings. I begged my mother to pull over. Initially she refused, but I convinced her. We U-turned and pulled back around. There we sat watching these two objects hover. Not a sound could be heard. Suddenly, the one on the left shot straight up at a speed I couldn't even comprehend. The one on the right hovered away from us, then it too shot up and was gone in the blink of an eye. We didn't report the incident because we feared people would think we were crazy. It took many years before I gave this accounting to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. It also took a few years before I was able to sleep peacefully at night without fear of something coming to get me. To this day, the only discontinuity to either of our retellings of this story is this. My mother says we got out of the car and walked over to the fence line to better view the UFOs. I maintained that I never left the car, but sat in the passenger side looking out the window. That is the only difference in our memory of our UFO sighting. I wonder why. Prologue, May 2nd, 1998. I hate these field trips. Always so dang boring, said Red Graham. Red stood with his arm over the back of the pen, fencing in 50 Black Angus cows. His red hair and freckles, standing out in the bright midday sun, gave reason to his nickname. His real name was Darrell Lewis Graham, but no one called him that except his grandmother. Red shuffled his booted feet in the dusty Oklahoma earth. At least it gets us out of class, man, Dave Forrester pointed out the obvious to his best friend. I'd rather be here smelling cow shit than sitting in trig listening to Mr. Jenkins try and explain angles. If you'd bathe once in a while, you wouldn't smell like cow shit, dumbass. Red punched Dave in the arm, laughing. Shut the hell up, you redneck. If anyone smells here, it's you. Dave covered his nose, trying not to laugh out loud. What the heck is that stench? You reek. It's Old Spice. Red pulled his shirt up to his nose and sniffed. It doesn't stink, dude. It's attractive to the ladies. He ran his hands down his tall, skinny form. And you know how much the ladies love me. Dave bent over double and gagged. I think I'm gonna be sick. Red kicked Dave in the butt, sending him flying into the dirt. 3 classmates turned and laughed at their antics. Dave sat up and leaned against the fence. That was uncool, dude, he said, laughing. Kiss my ass, Dave. Red walked over and put out his hand to his friend, pulling him up. Come on, everyone's moving into the barn, said Red. Together they followed the group, bringing up the rear while Dave slapped dust off his backside. What's in this building? Dave asked. It's where they house the cows before they load them in the back of the truck and haul them over to the slaughterhouse. Should be entertaining, Red said with moderate sarcasm. Dave looked around as they entered the large metal structure. The floors were concrete and it smelled like animal feces, industrial-strength cleanser, and hay. The class was standing before an indoor pen containing 11 cows. Mr. Hinkie, their FFA Future Farmers of America teacher, began to speak. Inside this pen are the next 11 heads of Angus to be taken to McShane's slaughterhouse. Fairhaven Farm delivers about 20 head of cattle a month to slaughter, which isn't much, but since they raise their cattle organically, it's a healthy number for a farm this size. Mostly, Fairhaven makes its money by growing wheat and organic vegetables. They have a sizable farmers market every Saturday. The Angus cattle are just a small percent of their operation. 2 Mexican farmhands entered the pen with cattle prods in hand. A third backed up a flatbed truck to the back of the pen from the opposite side of the barn. As Dave and the rest of the class watched, 2 men began to herd the cattle towards the now open back gate. Red laughed as the shorter farmhand zapped one of the cows on its hindquarters, making it bellow in protest. Did you see that, man? That cow is already getting fried. Makes me want a burger after this. Red slapped Dave on the shoulder, but he didn't respond. His eyes were drawn to one cow still laying down to the right side of the pen. It was mooing, but not rising. The taller farmhand walked over and started shouting at it. Subida vaca! Levantese! Prisa! He pointed the prodder at the cow's side and zapped it. Immediately the cow began to moo in protest, rising on shaky legs. The man kept prodding the cow, whose eyes rolled around in its head, terrified. As it came to a full stand, it became obvious that its back right leg was broken. It hung, awkwardly swinging back and forth as the cow tried not to put the hoof down. Shit, dude, the cow's injured, said Dave. 2 girls in the class began to cry. Mr. Hinkie, that cow is hurt. Make him stop, said Amber Thornton, a junior at Farley High. Barely 5'2", Amber had to stand on her toes to be seen and shout to be heard. "This is part of the process, kids," Mr. Hinkie explained matter-of-fact. "These cows are slated for the kill floor, so it doesn't much matter that it has a broken leg." "That ain't fucking right. I wouldn't treat my dog that way." Dave's alarm over the cow's predicament rose every time he heard it groan in pain. Slowly, on 3 legs, the cow made its way to the flatbed. Each step was punctuated by a painful blast of electricity from the bright red prodder. Eyes rolling wildly around in its sockets, the cow inched its way onto the truck, then collapsed. The 2 Mexican farmhands lifted the tailgate up on the flatbed and locked it into place. Dave stood stunned, not believing the cruelty he just witnessed. Beside him, he heard Red teasing Amber about her tears. Above that, he heard Mr. Hinkie telling the class that things like this are a fact of life, and they should all learn to accept it, since humans were at the top of the food chain. Quietly, Dave made a promise to himself that he'd never mistreat an animal or buy anything from Fairhaven Farm or McShane's again. He'd find a place that treated its cattle with respect. No animal should be put through what he had just seen. Silently, Dave said a prayer for the cow. After the field trip ended, the class was bussed over to Dairy Queen for lunch. For the first time, Dave didn't order a burger, but ate only fries and a shake instead. Throughout lunch, Red teased him about his delicate sensibilities. "Keep it up, man. All the laughing you're doing about that poor cow is going to come back and bite you in the ass someday. Grandma Effie is always saying no sin is hidden because someone is always watching. Just saying." With that, Dave stopped talking and drank his shake. Chapter 1, June 2010. Traveling home alone after a night out was not unusual for Dave Forrester. It was a Saturday night like any other. He had hung out with his buddies at the local watering hole, and after a few games of pool and a round or 2 of darts interspersed with beer and shots of wild turkey, he had clapped his buds on their arms, shaken hands, and promised to meet up again next week. So far, the only thing out of the ordinary had been the cute redhead seated at the far end of the bar all night. He kept sneaking looks at her, but Dave never quite got up the courage to approach her. She was prettier than he was used to, and he struggled with a slight inferiority complex. So when last call came around, he finished off his last Corona, told his best buddy Red he'd see him tomorrow sometime, glanced briefly at the pretty lady, offering the customary tipping of his hat in her direction, before heading out the door to his Chevy truck. Yep, nothing was new tonight, just the same old, and going home alone. Dave sighed heavily, feeling incredibly lonely. It had been a long time since he was last in a relationship, so long that he had forgotten how nice it felt to have a woman's arms around his waist at night, or how sweet the sound of feminine laughter could be. He might not remember those things, but he knew he missed them. It had been 3 years since Sherry dumped him after cheating on him with a married man twice her age. He still didn't understand how the hell that had happened, but the only thing Dave could figure out was the fellow was rich and had more to offer financially than he did. Sherry always did like gifts, and the stuffed bears, wildflowers, and infrequent dinners out to the steakhouse with the all-you-can-eat salad bar hadn't satisfied her. God knows he had tried. Dave felt one lone tear begin in his left eye, and he took a deep breath, sucking it up, refusing to allow any more tears to fall for that gal. Damn it, men just don't cry. Sherry was just plain materialistic, and love notes, hand-holding, and telling her he loved her, hadn't put designer clothes on her wonderfully sculpted body, hadn't slid onto her fingers like diamond rings, and could never fly her to Monaco first class like all the other guys' money had done. Sherry had no heart and didn't deserve his. With that last thought, Dave tried to concentrate on the road ahead of him as he headed off down the country lane that would lead to his old-fashioned farmhouse on 3 acres of land. The house and land had come to him through his grandparents. When his granddad died 5 years back, his grandma, Effie, had been all alone in the house, unable to handle the planting and harvesting of the wheat and hay. Dave's mom, Linda, suddenly put the idea into her son's head to move in with his grandmother and help take care of things. Grandma Effie hadn't wanted to lose the home she had shared with her husband Ernest for over 30 years. Dave knew he'd end up with no choice in the matter, not that he minded much helping Grandma out. The only setback had been in giving up his bachelor pad apartment, which put a crimp in his love life with Sherry. She complained a lot whenever she and Dave had to go to her place to have sex, said a grown man ought to have his own place. She never understood that sometimes a grown man also had obligations to others as well, but that was in the past. Grandma Effie declined in her health nonetheless after Ernest Hardy's death. She just couldn't seem to find a way to live her life without him, even with her grandson's help. She passed on a year and a half later, leaving the house and all the land to Dave. He'd been there ever since, making a go of farming. It wasn't much, but he found he loved the simple labor. It was hard work, but he worked for himself, and what he made off the sale of the wheat and hay paid the bills. For the most part, Dave was content. There were no lights out this far along the roadside, and one had to really pay attention to what was coming in order not to hit any wild animals running across the road. It was dark, quiet, and mighty peaceful with the warm July wind whipping through the rolled-down driver's side window. Dave drifted off into thought as he cruised along the 30-mile-per-hour stretch. Another mile and he'd be home, alone with his television and empty bed. Behind him, a light streaked across the starless sky like a small comet. Dave noticed the flash in his rearview mirror. It grew larger and seemed like it was headed right at the back of his truck. The light continued to grow until it blinded Dave. He tried to look in the mirror to see what the hell was going on. For a split second, he thought a carload of kids had driven up behind him and had their high beams on. But another split second later, the Chevy truck was fully enclosed in a blinding white light, and Dave barely got the chance to mutter, "What the?" before a shuddering explosion of sound, or was it an implosion, like millions of conversations at once robbed him of consciousness. The truck slowed and rolled to a stop in a small ditch off the side of the lane just a few hundred yards from Dave's front lawn. The light dimmed and then faded completely. Wisps of frost radiated off the truck and melted into the warm summer night air. All sound ceased into an eerie silence. The air was still, and Dave, unaware and unconscious, fell sideways in his seatbelt, hanging suspended above the bench seat. The car radio sputtered to life, softly playing Hank Williams' "I'm So Lonesome I Could Die." Chapter 2. Sharp cold stung his fingertips and his cheeks. Struggling to the surface of consciousness, fighting a lethargy that was weighing him down, Dave forced his brain to cooperate and managed to open one eyelid. It felt like his lashes were stuck together, but finally he got the other eye opened and focused on a rubber mat that read Chevrolet. He recognized it as the floor mat in his car, the one on the passenger side that was still completely legible and not half rubbed away by dirty work boots. His chest hurt, like when you had bronchitis and coughed too hard for too long. He realized he was hanging forward in the seat belt and slowly leaned back into the seat. The pressure on his chest lessened and breathing became easier. Looking around, Dave searched for signs of a car accident. He didn't see any. He gingerly turned his head to the right and then the left before looking into the rearview mirror for any telltale evidence of another car. Darkness greeted him. He looked straight ahead into the grass of the ditch he was settled in, searching the small area illuminated by the headlights of his truck. Nothing. Nothing but grass. No dead animals, no other car. Absolutely nothing greeted his visual investigation. He sat there trying to figure out what happened. The last thing he remembered was a really bright light coming from behind. He reached for the door handle and pulled it. The truck door didn't budge. He tried again and this time put his shoulder into it. With a snap and a crack, the door swung out. It had sounded like ice breaking. That's strange, he thought. Dave released his seatbelt and cautiously stepped out. The grass crunched like snow under his boots, and the road next to the ditch looked shiny on the surface. If it weren't the middle of July, he would have sworn it was a patch of black ice, but that was just crazy. It had to be some liquid, maybe from his truck, catching a reflection from the moon or the headlights. He stood there looking around into the quiet night. The quiet was so damn quiet it was frightening. Dave didn't hear any crickets chirping. He didn't hear any wind blowing. It was calm and still like the kind of quiet you notice right before a storm. He looked at the truck for any damage. It seemed sound and unharmed. Rubbing his chin in consternation, Dave turned to climb back in the truck. He was only a few hundred yards from home anyway. Sliding in and closing the door, he cranked the ignition. The radio station was blaring static, so he turned it off, aimed the wheels to the left, and pressed the gas pedal. The truck maneuvered back onto the road, and he was home in less than 5 minutes. He felt winded and sore. It had been one strange night, and Dave couldn't wait to fall into bed and forget about it. The night air refused to stir. It was stifling and thick. Clouds gathered as the barometer rose. A strong breeze suddenly whipped through the trees, and in the distance, thunder rumbled and lightning streaked the sky. A storm was brewing and heading right for Dave's farmhouse. Inside, he lay passed out across the bed with one leg outside of the sheet thrown haphazard over his nakedness. The wind-up alarm clock on the nightstand ticked away. A clap of thunder boomed nearby, followed by a bright blast of lightning. The bedroom lit up briefly and once again dimmed. The clock on the nightstand ceased ticking. Outside, hail began to fall, striking the ground and bouncing off the roof before emitting steam and melting away into the hot night. No other sound interrupted the fury of the passing storm. Dave slept on, unaware of all that faded away into the night. Chapter 3. A steady rain fell, soaking the ground and flooding the low-lying areas of the lane in front of Dave's house. Inside, swimming up into consciousness, Dave yawned and stretched in his bed. Rolling onto his stomach, he looked over at the clock on the nightstand. It read 4:06 a.m. Damn, he thought. Forgot to wind it up before going to sleep. He reached beyond the clock for his watch. Squinting to read the small numbers, he realized it was after 9 a.m. Well, hell, it's Sunday and I have nowhere to be anyway. Rolling onto his back again, Dave thought about the pretty redhead from the bar last night. She sure was something. Long, curly hair and nice legs. Petite was okay with him since he barely topped 6 foot. He liked the idea of being the big protector to a tiny little lady. She had large green eyes and pouty lips. Right about now, those pouty lips would really be appreciated as Dave realized that the thought of her had elicited quite a response out of him. Reaching down, he grasped his erection and began stroking it, while imagining all the ways in which he would like to see Miss Redhead's head bobbing up and down over him. Closing his eyes, he smiled. Panting and moaning, Dave thrust into his hand faster and faster, spilling his release all over the sheets. He sighed. Good thing it was Sunday and he could spend the morning washing the bedding before starting a day of doing absolutely nothing. Rising from the bed, he headed into the bathroom to pee. He stood there, one hand on his hip, watching the yellow stream hit the water. He felt a little cold and wondered if he was coming down with something. Reaching down to flush, he stopped. If it's yellow, let it mellow. He then pushed the shower curtain aside and turned on the water. When the shower began to steam, he climbed in. The heat from the hot water seeped into his stiff muscles, working out the kinks from last night's weird accident. He sang in the shower, badly, but still he sang. Really love your peaches, wanna shake your tree. Dave finished his shower, brushed his teeth, and got dressed. After he put on his t-shirt and his faded Levi's, he pulled the sheets from the bed and walked to the laundry room located off the kitchen. Throwing the laundry into the washer and starting the cycle, he walked back to the kitchen to cook up a little Sunday morning breakfast. He pulled a carton of eggs out of the fridge along with some bacon. Slapping 2 frying pans onto the stove's burners, he heated them up. He went back into the fridge for some orange juice and filled his glass. Dave looked out of the kitchen window at the steady fall of rain. That's just damn depressing, he thought. Can't even hang outside today. Shit. He cracked 2 brown farm-fresh eggs into the first pan and laid 4 strips of organic bacon into the second pan. After a moment, he added 2 more strips of bacon. He liked bacon and tried not to feel guilty about that. Dave always bought humane organic meats after a high school field trip to a farm northeast of Farley in his senior year. His FFA teacher thought the kids should see how farms were run, but his primary goal was to teach them how to properly raise farm animals. After that trip, Dave just couldn't stomach the idea of eating an animal that had lived a tortured life, being mistreated by people who didn't care if they hurt an animal or not. Red had laughed at him when he saw how upset his friend got over the cow with the broken leg. Dave often pointed out to Red that he'd be raging if someone mistreated his little dog Elvis. Red agreed but said, "A cow isn't a dog, man. Dogs are smart." David pushed his teenaged emotions down, trying not to seem weak in front of the guys. But after that day, he's insisted that his mom buy only humane, organically grown, grass-fed or free-range meats and eggs. While the eggs cooked sunny side up and the bacon sizzled, he put 2 slices of bread into the toaster. When they popped back up, he buttered them and set them aside on a paper towel. The eggs were done, so he slid them out of the pan and onto a plate. Drinking his juice in between tasks, he flipped the bacon over one last time to make it extra crispy. He set out a couple of layers of paper towels so he could lay the bacon on them to soak up the excess grease. He turned off the stove, took his plate and his toast to the little dinette table. Dave returned to the kitchen to get his bacon and grabbed the grape Bama jelly out of the fridge. Palming some silverware, he went back to the table, sat down, and began to eat his breakfast. It was quiet except for the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof of the house. Dave chewed his food and wished for the 1,000th time that he wasn't so damn lonely. After washing his breakfast dishes, he decided to see what was on the boob tube since there was nothing else he could do in this rain. Sitting down in his recliner, Dave flipped on the remote and was greeted by static. He changed the channel, more static. He flipped through all his channels and found nothing but static. God damn it, the rain's killed the signal to my satellite dish. Dave threw the remote down on the floor, pissed that the rain had managed to take away the only form of entertainment he might have today. Well, not his only entertainment, but he couldn't very well spend the day masturbating. Damn. Deciding to brave the rain and head into town for a little grocery shopping and maybe pick up a couple of movies, Dave got up to put on his boots. He grabbed his ball cap, pulling the old blue angel's hat over his brown curls. Dressed, he grabbed his truck keys and headed for the door. A cold gust of wind greeted him when he opened the front door. Holy crap, he thought. What the hell is going on? Here it was, the middle of July, and it was as cold as a witch's titty outside. It felt like it was around 40 degrees. Dave was dumbfounded, but he opened the hall closet and pulled out his jean jacket that he normally wore in the winter months. He ran to his truck, trying not to get soaked. Once in, he put the key in the ignition and cranked the engine. The sound of his old Chevy roaring to life made him feel a little better. He turned on the radio and static fizzled and popped from the speakers. He wondered if the weird thing that happened last night might have blown out his radio. He'd have to have Red check it out when he got into town. Red wasn't just his longtime friend from all the way back to grade school, but also the town mechanic. When they were in high school together, Dave and Red were always getting into some kind of trouble on account of the fact that they couldn't resist daring each other to do stupid things. Like the time Red dared Dave to climb into the window of the girls' basketball team's shower and take a picture of the bathing beauties. Dave had been caught red-handed by the team coach, Ms. Schakowsky, and she had dragged Dave by the ear all the way to the principal's office where he received 3 Saturday detentions. Red had laughed his ass off and had gotten away scot-free, the rotten bastard. Dave had to get up at the crack of dawn 3 Saturdays in a row and sit in a near-empty classroom for 8 hours doing homework and other assorted assigned tasks, but he at least had the memory of all those luscious, naked gals to keep him inspired. He grinned like an idiot every time he passed one of them in the halls, and each one had glared at him with their meanest face. Dave didn't care. He had seen everything they had to offer, and no one could take that away from him. He didn't get the picture, much to Red's dismay, but that just made it better for Dave, since he had felt like he had done all the work, so deserved all the reward. He had a mental picture of titties and tight asses and both smooth and bushy bushes. He could whack off to that image for years. If Red wanted to know what he saw, well, damn it, he could just climb up into that window and see for himself. In fact, that was the very next dare that got them both into trouble again. Hell, to this day, when he saw Charlotte Evans or Cindy Roberts, he got a huge boner just remembering them soaping themselves up in the girls' shower. Charlotte had the prettiest ass, and Cindy's knockers were like ripe peaches. No matter the years that have passed since high school, those two gals will forever be young, hot, and ripe for the picking in his memory. Dave came out of his reverie and realized he was approaching the edge of town. It was early Sunday morning, and he didn't see any cars out and about. He drove to the corner grocery and pulled up to the side of the curb. Getting out, he ran to the front doors and came to a dead stop. The automatic doors didn't open. He looked through the glass and didn't see anyone inside. That's strange. The sign on the window read the store hours on Sunday were 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., but no one was around. Dave knocked on the glass several times, but no one answered. He stayed under the overhang and turned around, surveying the other businesses across the street. He didn't see anyone coming or going. In fact, there were absolutely no cars on the road. What the hell? Where is everyone? Dave walked over to the newspaper dispenser and pulled some change out of his pocket. He dropped in 75 cents and opened the door. He reached inside and pulled out a paper. Flipping it open, he looked at the front page, anticipating the Sunday news then realized it was yesterday's paper. God damn it, wasn't anyone working today? Dave stood with the paper in his hand, surveying the street. It was quiet, except for the rain. There weren't any cars, people, or voices to break the steady fall of the rain. Dave wondered if maybe something had happened that made everyone stay indoors or at home today. Did he miss something important on the radio, the TV? Hell, he wouldn't know since his satellite signal was out and his car radio seemed to be blown. He blinked twice and rubbed his chin, feeling the stubble he hadn't shaved off that morning. Maybe someone was at the video store, he thought. Dave put the old newspaper above his head and made a mad dash across the street. He was pelted with fat raindrops, but at least he managed to keep his hat dry. On the other side of the street, store windows were dark. Loose pamphlets and other debris blew down the street past Dave's feet as he walked into the cold wind towards the far corner. He tried to keep close to the shops and under their overhangs. In all his years growing up in Farley, Oklahoma, he'd never seen anything like this. Never had he seen this thriving little town so deserted. It was just plain spooky, and he hoped he ran into someone soon because it was really starting to freak him out. Dave reached the corner and headed for the door to the Hollywood video. He grasped the door handle and pulled. It opened. Thank you, Jesus, someone's open. Feeling a smile start to spread across his lips, he put the wet paper down on the floor inside the door and shook himself like a dog shaking off a bath. No hello greeted him, but hey, it was early and maybe the kid working this morning was in the back or putting returned movies back on the shelves. Dave walked in and checked the board to see what new movies were out that he could rent. He looked for action flicks. Action flicks were the best, especially old-fashioned sword fights. No new sword fight movies, but Bruce Willis had his umpteenth Die Hard out. That would work. He located the movie and then picked up a Coke and some popcorn on the way to the register. He waited. No one came to the checkout. Dave looked around the store and saw no one. Hey, he shouted. Anyone working today or what? No answer. This is getting annoying, he thought. Hey! His voice echoed around the empty store. Dave leaned over the counter and looked around. He didn't see much until his eyes lit upon the far corner near the drop box. On the floor was a pair of khaki pants, a blue Hollywood video shirt, a pair of shoes, and what looked like a watch next to some boxers. Was that a sock poking out from beneath the pants leg? Geez, did the guy working strip off his clothes? Oh, Dave thought. Maybe the punk kid was getting some in the back room and he had walked in at an inopportune moment. Inopportune my ass. He's on the clock and I'm the damn customer. I'm all for a young guy getting some, but this is just too much. Hey, there's a customer out here. Dave cleared his throat loudly. He was all ready to forgive and forget, especially if the fool turned out to be a real dorky kid. He understood what it was like to be a dorky kid with raging hormones. No dorky kid came running out of the back. No embarrassed teens presented themselves at all. Feeling truly pissed now, he walked to the back room. The door was slightly ajar and he pushed it open with a bang. Hey kid, I don't care what you're doing, but could you please just check me and then you can get back to it? The room was empty. It was a small room with one desk and one chair and a 4-line phone sitting on one side. Dave stared in confusion. He walked a little further in, noticed a small employee bathroom to the right behind the office door. The light was on, but there was no one inside. This is too much. Where is everyone? He ran a frustrated hand through his hair, knocking his hat off. He caught the hat and replaced it. Dave set the movie he was holding down on the desk and turned and walked out back into the store. He kept on walking to the front doors and stepped outside. What he saw stopped him cold. The rain had stopped. It was still quiet as hell, but nearly an inch of snow covered the ground before him. Icicles hung from the storefront overhangs. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and Dave felt it start to seep into his bones. He could see his own breath as he shouted, "What the hell is going on?" His words echoed off into the distance and faded away. No answer came. No one looked outside their windows or shouted back at him to shut up. No sound, no wind, no birds, no engines, no voices. Nothing moved. Dave felt panic start to set in. He felt cold invading through the thin threads of his jean jacket. He felt scared for the first time since he was a child, afraid of what might be under his bed in the dark. He felt his nose start to run and wiped it on the back of his sleeve. Setting off towards his truck, he slipped once on the icy road before making it safely inside. He sat there looking out at the snow falling and ice forming on his windshield. What should I do? What's going on? Where is everyone? The answer lay frozen in the July air, unable to find its voice. Chapter 4. Across town in a rundown room at the Motel 6, Maggie stirred to life by kicking the covers up off her feet. She lay there, face down with one hand under the pillow and the other covering her eyes. Wild red hair spread out in every direction like a crazy curly stain. She sniffed. Stale cigarette stench greeted her senses. It was a remnant of last night's little drunk fest at the local bar around the corner. She had been so plastered when she got in that showering seemed like a dangerous game to play. At least she hadn't been so steeped that she didn't think about the possibility of drowning in the tub. Instead, she had stripped off her ashtray-smelling clothing, stumbled down onto the toilet and peed for what seemed like days before weaving her way to the double bed. To say she passed out when her head hit the pillow would be an understatement. It was more like she passed out as she fell onto the pillow. Something tasted like poop in her mouth. Her teeth felt fuzzy, and Maggie was certain she had at least 3 more gallons of pee waiting impatiently to be let out again. Ugh, she moaned. Then she sat up slowly. Ow! Holding her head, Maggie struggled not to cry in pain. Carefully, she put one foot on the floor. It was cold. That's weird, she thought. And it's carpeted, too. Granted, it's really thin, cheap carpeting, but still. The other foot joined the first, and she hauled herself up and trudged to the toilet. The seat was cold also, which made her pee more. Goosebumps formed on her naked skin while last night's case of beer left her bladder. Finally, she flushed. Reaching inside the plastic shower curtain, Maggie turned on the hot water, letting it run for a moment while she brushed her teeth. With the dog poop taste gone and the fuzzy sweaters on her teeth removed, she felt a little better. She stepped into the shower and under the spray, letting the hot water cascade over her head and warm her body. A little shampoo, conditioner, and lavender soap helped scrub away the smoky smell, and it livened her up some more. She felt better. She smelled better, too. Maggie wrapped herself in 2 towels, one on her head and the other around her body, and sat cross-legged on the end of the bed. She grabbed the remote from the bed and clicked the power button. Static greeted her. She tried to change channels, but each channel held nothing but static. Cheap-ass motel. She finished getting dressed and blow-dried her tangle of red curls. I look like shit, she said as she looked at herself in the mirror. Throwing the brush down on the counter, Maggie turned to grab her Skechers. She glanced one more time in the mirror and figured that her jeans and t-shirt were good enough to go get some breakfast. She didn't care how she looked beyond being clean at this point. She was hungover, dehydrated, and grieving. She just didn't care right now. There was a time not long ago that she cared a lot. Brad was the love of her life, and they were going to get married next month. The engagement lasted about a year, just long enough to plan a wedding. His family loved her, her family loved him, everything was perfect. They were going to be Mr. and Mrs. Travers and would live happily ever after. 3 weeks ago, happily ever after turned into never happy again when a semi-truck plowed into Brad's Alero while he was on his way home from work. The driver of the semi had fallen asleep at the wheel and then veered into oncoming traffic. They said Brad never felt any pain. It was instantaneous, but what did they know? How could they know that in those few split seconds right before the collision, when Brad knew that truck was going to smack right into him, that he didn't feel sheer terror, and then 1/2 second of pain on impact before life left him? How could they know? How could anyone know? The first week after his death went by like a nightmare. It was one thing after another until the funeral. She stood there in the rain watching his casket being lowered into the ground. It was so final. She had gone a little hysterical after that, crying, "But he can't breathe! How can he breathe in there?" Her mother pulled her into her arms, consoling her. It seemed the tears would never end. Then the shocker came at the reading of his will. Of course, they hadn't been married yet, so Maggie wasn't entitled to anything really, but Brad had made her his sole beneficiary on his life insurance policy. The lawyer said he had made the change 2 months ago. Brad's mother, Ellen, lost her shit and yelled and screamed and called her a gold digger. Maggie couldn't believe it. What the hell was this woman screaming about? She had just lost her fiancé, the love of her life, and now her almost future mother-in-law was cursing her like a street whore. Maggie couldn't take it anymore and ran out. She ran and kept running for 7 days. She had driven from one little podunk town to the next until she had reached Farley last night. She checked into the Motel 6 and then asked for directions to the closest bar. Each little town she had come upon had been toasted and drunk to until she couldn't remember how she got back to her room. She didn't even care. All she cared about was forgetting the pain, drowning it out. Didn't matter if she never woke up again as far as she was concerned. She grabbed her purse and room key and headed for the door. She threw it open and stepped out. Maggie stood on the other side of the threshold with her mouth hanging open. "Son of a bitch, it's freaking snowing!" The cold hit her thin summer clothes and went right into her skin, stinging her. She went back inside quickly, slamming the door. Snow? Holy shit! She looked out the cheap plastic blinds at the snow falling. It had to be a couple inches thick, and there were icicles hanging from the second floor above her. Maggie went back to her small stash of clothes in her duffel bag. She foraged around until she pulled out one of Brad's long-sleeved button-downs. It was the only shirt with sleeves that she had with her. Hell, it was July for shit's sake. She threw it on over her t-shirt and picked her purse and room key up again. She would have to make a dash for her car and then maybe stop somewhere to pick up a jacket real quick before finding a diner. It took forever to warm up her little Honda Civic. Poor thing, it wasn't used to snow. Well, heck, being from South Texas, Maggie wasn't used to it either. She would just have to take it slow and run the heater. It was strange to hear the crunch of snow and ice under her shoes. Maggie's thoughts were in a jumble. Driving around Farley shouldn't be too hard. It's a pretty small town anyway. There has to be a retailer somewhere, maybe a Walmart. Might be kind of hard to find a jacket at this time of year, though. Oh well, shouldn't take too long. A good, thick sweater or running suit top or something like it will do. The snow has to be some kind of El Niño fluke, and will probably be gone by tomorrow. Her stomach growled. Okay, I'm going to feed you. Just chill out. Then she laughed. Chill out. Now that's funny. It was the first time Maggie had laughed about anything since Brad died. Down the long main street, lights changed, but no traffic crossed the intersections. Dave sat in his truck with the heater running, thinking as hard as he had ever done in his life. In the distance, a small red Honda Civic came into view. It drove closer to the corner where Dave sat. Finally, Dave looked up and noticed. He had never been happier to see a car in his life. It meant he wasn't the only person around. He smiled. As he watched, the little car started to chug and jerk. Slowly it sputtered, then died. Inside the Honda, Maggie cursed loudly. Son of a bitch! What's wrong? Every light on the dashboard lit up at once. She tried pressing the gas, but the car didn't respond. She turned it off and then tried to turn it back on again. Nothing. She wanted to cry. It was getting cold inside the car. She reached into her purse and rummaged for her cell phone. She didn't know who she was going to call since no one knew where she was, but maybe she could get a number for a tow truck. She flipped the phone top and pressed the on button. Her phone came on, but stayed in the same screen, searching. Then, no signal. What? No way! She threw the phone onto the seat, frustrated. She put her hands on the steering wheel and leaned her face on her hands. Okay, think, Maggie. What are you going to do? You can't stay in the car. You'll freeze. Where to go? Where to go? A loud tap on the window startled her. Looking up at the ice-frosted glass, she saw a smiling face looking back. She unrolled the window. Sorry I scared you, ma'am. I noticed your car died. Need some help? Said Dave. Yes, I do. I don't know what happened. She just died. Maggie's voice trailed off before she could say died. She just couldn't bring herself to say that word. Well, let's get you out of there and inside my truck before you freeze. I can take you to my friend's garage and he can send a tow truck for your car. Maggie opened the door and grabbed her purse and keys. She locked the door. Kind of funny since it wasn't running. No one would be able to steal it anyway. She looked at the man, trying to decide if he was safe. He was close to her age. He seemed like just an average guy, sort of familiar too, like she had seen him somewhere. The freezing wind sliced through her thin clothing, deciding for her what was the safest and smartest thing to do. They ran back to his truck and got in quick. It was warm inside since he left it running. Thank God. "By the way, I'm Dave Forrester." Dave offered his hand. Maggie Harris." She shook his hand. "Nice to meet you, Maggie," said Dave. "Thanks for being there. I don't know what I would have done. My cell couldn't pick up a signal, and I wouldn't know who to call here anyway." "Not from around here, huh?" Dave smiled. Damn, it was sure nice to find someone after the weird morning he had had. He recognized her as the pretty redhead from the bar the night before. "No." Maggie didn't offer any other explanation. They drove 2 streets over and 1 street left. Dave pulled his truck up to a garage with a big sign out front that read, "Red's Automotive Repairs." "Stay here while I go grab Red, okay?" "Sure," Maggie smiled. Dave hopped out, pulled his jacket close around him, and slipped through the snow to the door next to the large garage door. He pulled the handle, but the door was locked. He knocked 3 times and stood shivering, waiting for Red to open up. He was there every day, rain or shine. No one came to the door. He knocked again, pounded really. "Red, it's Dave, man, open up." Still, no answer. Dave reached into his pocket for his cell phone and dialed Red's number. It rang and rang. He could hear it ringing just beyond the door. Red didn't have an answering machine because he was usually always there to answer. That was strange. Dave disconnected the call and tried Red's home number. There, the answering machine caught the call. "Hey, Red, it's Dave. I'm down here at the garage. Where the hell are you?" Click. The call was lost in 1 click. Dave looked down at his phone and saw no signal. "What the freak?" He looked back at Maggie sitting in his truck. Not knowing what else to do, he went back to the truck. Inside, he said, "I don't know what's going on. He's usually here. I tried to call him, but the phone lost signal. I can take you to his house if you don't mind. It's just around the corner. Maybe the snow kept him home?" "Yeah. What's with this snow? I didn't know it could snow in July. Was there something on the news?" Maggie asked. "I don't know. I couldn't get any signal on my satellite this morning," Dave sighed. Maggie looked strange. "You know, I couldn't get any signal on the TV in my room either, and they're on a cable system." Dave and Maggie exchanged confused looks. "Let's just go to Red's and see what's what. There has to be some explanation for what's going on, right?" Maggie looked a little more reassured. Dave, on the other hand, looked far more concerned. It just wasn't like his friend not to be at his garage. If he wasn't at home either, Dave was going to start to really get scared because something really, really bad would have to have happened to keep Red from coming into work. He put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the street. Silently, he prayed. The first thing Maggie noticed about Rodeo Avenue was the quiet. Dave wasn't saying anything. The radio in his truck wasn't working. The wind had picked up and howled like a lonely specter while fat snowflakes landed and then froze on the windshield. The defroster in the old Chevy worked overtime trying to keep the glass clear. In such weather, it would be expected that most people would stay home. But the fact that not a single car passed them on the way over, and not a single chimney on the few houses that had them emitted any smoke, made for an unnerving silence. "So which house is it?" Maggie tried to ease her own nerves with this simple question. "It's the third from the last down there on the right. See the brown one with the basketball hoop in the driveway?" Dave pointed to the driveway where, sure enough, Red's Ford F-150 was parked. The feeling of relief that filled Dave was strong. "Thank God! I was really getting scared that some plague had just wiped out the world or something." Dave's laugh sounded good to Maggie's ears. She, too, had started getting frightened by the bewildering lack of people out and about. "I guess people just don't like to get out in freak weather. Probably something came over the news last night and we just both missed it," she said. "Yeah, I had a little accident on the way home last night and it seems to have knocked out my radio here." Dave slapped the dashboard for emphasis. "Otherwise, I might have heard the weather report. I'll have to call my parents when I get inside. I bet they've been trying to call me." With each word, Dave felt better and better. He pulled up in the driveway behind the Ford truck and put it in park. He turned off the ignition and ran around to open the door for Maggie, who was already letting herself out. "Sorry," she began. "Here, let me get that for you." They said their words simultaneously as Dave finished opening the door for her. Maggie blushed a little, not used to anyone doing anything nice for her since Brad was alive. Actually, she couldn't remember a time when Brad had come around a car to open the door for her. She just always did these things herself. The thought of Brad hit her with renewed pain. As suddenly as the blush appeared, it retreated from her cheeks, leaving her skin pale. She glanced up at Dave as he stuck out his elbow for her to take while he guided her through the snow-covered grass to the front door. He had a good face, strong jaw, but not overly. His nose was a smidge oversized, but seemed to fit him well. His lips were shapely, not too thin and not too fat. It was his eyes, she figured, that conveyed who he was. They were a light blue surrounded by thick brown lashes. His brows sat above them with not much else to do except top them off. He wasn't one of those facially expressive people whose eyebrows rose and fell in exaggerated configurations. Like the cool blue eyes below, they were just calm, steady. Maggie concluded then and there that Dave was a steady individual, one you could always count on to be who he was. They arrived on the front doorstep and stomped their feet to get the snow off. Laughing a little, Dave rang the doorbell. "Red, it's Dave," he yelled through the door while trying to blow warm air on his cold hands. "Ring it again. Maybe he's asleep," said Maggie. She was holding her arms around herself in a vain attempt to stay warm. Dave rang the bell again, then knocked to make sure he roused Red. "Red," he said again. No answer. Dave reached down to try the doorknob. It was locked. He looked at Maggie shivering in the cold. He knew he had to get her inside before she froze up like a popsicle. He reached above the doorframe with his right hand, feeling for the extra key Red always kept there. He knew Red kept that key there for emergencies. Usually the emergency was just that Red forgot his house key. "Hold on, Maggie. I'm sure Red won't mind if we just come in," he said while unlocking the front door. "I'll just go kick his lazy ass out of bed and then we'll see what's what." "I hope he has his heater on," she said, following Dave inside. "You and me both." Dave waited till Maggie passed him, then closed the front door. It wasn't much warmer inside. Apparently Red hadn't turned on the heat. "Shoot, not much of an improvement," she said. "Darrell Lewis Graham, I'm turning on your heater, you cheap son of a bitch, and then I'm coming in there to kick your lazy ass. Get up," said Dave as he flipped on the thermostat in the hallway. It clicked on immediately after he set it to 75 degrees. The smell of burnt air filter hit the air. "God, that stinks. I hate the smell of a heater when it first turns on," said Maggie. "Yeah, it's not a good smell. Hey, Red, did you hear me, buddy?" Dave continued down the hall and took a left turn into the open doorway leading to Red's bedroom. Maggie wandered into the living room and took in the decor. There wasn't much to take in. An old gray couch with a blue quilt folded over the back occupied the greatest space against the back wall. Above the back of the couch was a wide window that looked out over the backyard. One navy blue recliner sat off to the right, and both seating areas faced a 32-inch Sony television. A folding card table made up the dining area with 4 folding metal chairs. Although it was tidy, it still appeared to be what it was, a bachelor pad. Dave came back out into the living room. He stood there saying nothing. His face turned ashen. "What is it? What's wrong?" asked Maggie. Dave's eyes connected with hers. She saw something in them that sent a shiver down her spine, not one from the cold, but from sheer fear. Without a word, she walked towards Dave and looked into the bedroom. There, on the unmade bed, lay a stain of red in the outline of a human body. Where the hips and buttocks area should have been, lay a pair of boxer shorts. It looked like someone had taken red paint and painted the form of a body, then dressed it with a pair of blue boxers with white vertical stripes. It smelled faintly of old blood, like the smell most gals become acquainted with when they have their period. There was never any mistaking the smell of blood. It was faintly coppery. "What the hell is that?" Maggie turned her eyes to Dave. They stood no more than 2 feet apart. Something has happened." Dave looked haunted. His eyes were looking at her, but were not focused on her. "I have to call my mom. I need to call my mom." He walked over to the phone on the breakfast bar. "Is that blood? Is that really blood?" she asked. I don't know. I need to call my mom." Dave picked up the phone, dialing his parents' house. He put the phone to his ear and waited. It rang and rang, but no one answered. His parents didn't keep an answering machine like most folks. They did have caller ID, though. "They aren't picking up. They should be picking up." Dave's voice got louder with each word. He hung up and stared at the phone. He picked it back up again and dialed 911. "Who are you calling now?" "The police. An ambulance. Someone. Something has happened to Red," he shouted. "You don't know that yet, Dave," said Maggie. She reached out to put her hand on his shoulder. Dave shook it off. I've known Red all my life. I know what's in that bedroom ain't right. Something has happened, Maggie. We need help. The line continued to ring with no answer. After the 20th ring, Dave hung up, hard. Damn it! Where the hell is everyone? He began to walk through the entire house, checking closets, the other 2 rooms, then the garage. He opened the back door and walked out to the backyard, searching every corner. When he came back in, he was shivering and looking lost. Dave settled his gaze back on Maggie, who stood there with her arms wrapped around herself. She waited patiently for him to get a grip. Her big green eyes were filled with compassion and also filled with something else, fear. He realized he didn't like seeing fear in her eyes. Get it together, Forrester, he thought. He couldn't do anything about waylaying her fears just then, but there was something he could do. Dave marched back to the closet in the front hallway. He opened the door and reached inside, pulling out a black leather coat. It was Red's second favorite to his Marlboro brown duster. He came forward and placed it around her shoulders. Maggie felt his warm, reassuring hand settle briefly on her shoulders. She turned her head and looked at him. Thanks, she said, smiling slightly. I'm sure he won't mind if you borrow it. I couldn't stand to see you cold anymore, he said softly. Dave lifted his hat off his head and ran his hands through his brown curls. Maggie watched, noting the gesture. Replacing his bald cap, Dave said, I think we should drive over to my parents' house. I'm worried about them. On the way, we can stop by the police department and I can have someone come over here and check it out. Sure, that sounds like a good plan. Let's get out of here. On the way out, Dave, conscientious soul that he was, adjusted the thermostat back down to 65 degrees. Just so it won't be too cold when the police come, he said to himself. Maggie smiled to herself at his comment as she walked back out into the cold. Dave came out behind her, replaced the extra key on top of the door frame, and turned to offer her his arm. Steady, she thought. Steady as a rock even now. As he held the passenger door open for her, she noted that she felt a little better now that she was snug inside Red's leather coat. Although too big for her, it was keeping the majority of the cold off of her. Dave climbed in beside her and started the engine. The heater kicked on, blowing cold air. It took a few moments to heat back up. As they drove back down Rodeo Avenue, Dave turned to look at Maggie. She seemed so small inside Red's coat. I don't know what's going on, but I want you to know I'll look out for you. Maggie felt tears sting her eyes. She swallowed hard, not wanting to show how truly afraid she was becoming. Everything that had happened from the moment she woke up boded badly for her. The only good thing that had happened so far was meeting Dave. If it wasn't for him, this nightmare would be complete, and she might have just done the one thing she had been slowly doing for the past several weeks: kill herself. She blinked the tears away and smiled a little smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dave reached over and put his hand on her cheek, wiping away the one tear that had fallen despite her best efforts to keep it at bay. She caught his hand in hers, and they drove through town, 2 lonely people linked together by their entwined fingers. The contact was the only comfort they felt as they looked out at the streets, the homes, and the businesses and saw not a single person, not one soul milling about. Farley had turned into a frozen ghost town. The nausea she felt from her hangover turned to a nausea born of pure fear. Dave's fingers tightened around hers. He rubbed the back of her hand with his thumb in slow circles, trying to be calming, but inside he was reeling with the sick feeling that something he would not be able to comprehend in its scope had occurred overnight while he had been sleeping. Something happened, and for some reason, only he and Maggie were here to witness it. Chapter 5. The police station parking lot was deserted except for one patrol car. There weren't any cars parked in the employee section either. Dave pulled up to the front and parked. He looked at Maggie. "Stay here," he said. No other words needed to follow, since they were both thinking the same thing. What if no one is there? Dave left the car running as he got out and walked to the front door. He stuffed his hands deep into his pockets, trying to keep them warm. The wind whipped at his hat, but it stayed on. Maggie watched from the toasty cab of the truck as Dave reached out and opened the door to the station house. He disappeared inside. The quiet that enshrouded her was deafening. Her ears began to ring a little. Then, just as suddenly, They stopped. The engine of the Chevy humming along was the only thing that should have broken the silence. But something else, something she couldn't pinpoint, was causing a buzzing feeling of panic to bubble up inside of her. Where is everyone? She thought. It's mid-afternoon on a Sunday. People should be out and about, even if just a little in this crazy weather. The wind began to howl fiercely, and clouds gathered, darkening the sky. Maggie shifted uneasily in her seat. The sky looked like a time-lapse television segment where everything is speeded up. It was so dark now that the police station lampposts' automatic lights came on. Looking out the passenger window, Maggie saw two bright lights shoot from left to right across the clouds. If she had blinked, she would have missed it. It was like seeing two spotlights without their source directional beams. There was no sound. In the distance beyond the corner traffic lights, a dark shadow moved like smoke curling upon itself. It seemed to have human shape, but no real form. Two others followed it as the first one walked through the wall of the 7-Eleven on the far corner. Maggie forgot to breathe, then fought a scream. She covered her mouth to hold it back, afraid that in the unnatural silence she'd be heard. Inside, Dave stood at the counter. There wasn't anyone there. No phones rang. No one came out to the front. It was just quiet. Feeling on the verge of panic, he walked to the door that led to the other side of the counter. No one shouted, "Hey, you can't go in there." On the other side, Dave looked around. There was an open door that led to the back. He walked towards it. "Anyone back here?" he shouted. Silence. Leaning through, he looked around at another room with 6 desks. No one sat at the desks. A patch of red caught Dave's eye. It was peeking around the leg of the last desk on the right. Slowly, he walked towards it. As he got closer and leaned down, he saw what it was. A cattle prodder. A red-handled cattle prodder. What the frick? His hand reached down to pick it up before he even thought about how he probably shouldn't be touching it. Setting the thing back down, Dave stood up. He looked around the room again, spying a gun cabinet in the back. He stared at it thoughtfully. Without hesitating a moment more, he went straight to the cabinet and opened it. Inside were several rifles and firearms, along with ammunition. He grabbed a shotgun, 2 police-issue handguns, and several boxes of ammo. Something was going on that Dave knew was not good. He shoved the 2 handguns into his waistband and the boxes of ammo in his jacket pockets. "I ain't going out like a punk," he muttered. A hand grabbed his shoulder. "Hey!" Dave screamed and whipped around with the rifle held out like a shield. Maggie jumped back, tripping over the corner of the desk and landing on her ass. "Dave, it's me!" She put her hands up to ward him off. "Jesus Christ, Maggie, you scared the living shit out of me. I'm sorry. I couldn't stay out there anymore." She looked up at him with tears swimming in her big green eyes. In a smaller voice, she said, "I'm so scared." She struggled with telling him what she saw, deciding against it. Dave knelt down and set the rifle on the floor. He scooted closer to Maggie and sat down next to her. Gathering her close to him, he held her while she began to cry. "What's happening?" she sniffled. "Where is everyone?" "I don't know, Mags. I just don't know." Dave didn't know what else to do. Holding her seemed like the only thing he could do. His heart was still hammering from the fright she gave him. Maggie's curly red head was tucked under his chin. She smelled like shampoo and flowers. She felt soft and warm. He remembered seeing her last night at the bar. She'd been drunk then. He knew that now because what he'd thought was an interested look from her could only now, in retrospect, be described as a glazed-over drunken stare. The Maggie he knew now, after only about an hour, was clear-headed, kind, and somewhat reserved. She wasn't a bar floozy. He almost felt guilty for fantasizing over her this morning. Almost. Recalling the thoughts he had had of her then made heat rush to his groin. "Now is not the time for this, Dave," he thought to himself. "Get it under control, man." As if sensing the change within him, Maggie's skin prickled with awareness. Dave hadn't moved a muscle, but the comforting hug had just made a radical turn towards something far less comfortable. Heat suffused Maggie's cheeks. In that moment, she noticed a light, very masculine scent rising off his skin. His shirt smelled like detergent. His body gave off a combination scent of Irish Spring and man. Feeling safe and protected within the circle of his arms, she looked up slowly at his face. Dave's eyes were already on hers, steady. It seemed like an hour ticked by in those few seconds before he slowly lowered his head and brushed his lips across hers. The kiss was soft, questioning whether or not to proceed. Maggie sighed and melted into him. Dave deepened the kiss until they both were breathless. She tasted sweet. Kissing her felt so good. Pulling back, he gazed at her flushed face. She's so pretty, he thought. Maggie opened her eyes and looked up. Slightly breathless, a little guilty, but somehow unrepentant, she began to smile. Dave watched a million emotions and thoughts rush across her lovely face in a matter of seconds. He was fascinated. My butt hurts. Dave blinked, then burst out laughing. Of all the things she could have said in that one sweet moment, she chose in that time to complain about her ass. Seeing him lose control made Maggie laugh too. It was the first time today either of them felt anything else besides confusion, tension, and fear. It was nice. We need to get going. Didn't you say we were going to your parents' house? Her soft voice reminded Dave that they were in the middle of a crisis. Yeah. He looked at her a moment longer, not wanting to lose the warm feelings they had shared. Sighing, Dave came to and helped Maggie sit up. He got up first, then grabbed her hands and pulled her up alongside him. He didn't hesitate to wrap his arms around her one last time. He just tightened his arms and rested his chin on top of her head. She fit like a glove against him. Feeling cheeky, Dave slid one hand down her back and rubbed her ass. She giggled. What are you doing? You said your ass hurt. I'm just trying to be a gentleman and make it feel better. Maggie backed up and slapped at his hands. Dave grinned shamelessly, forgetting for a split second that the world hadn't disappeared, but only for a second. He picked up the rifle from the floor and slung his free arm around her shoulders. They headed out to the front, back into the serious situation that wouldn't go away. Dave? Yeah. What are we going to do if your parents aren't there? Maggie peeked up at Dave. His eyes, calm so far, sparked with pain. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Let's just get over there and see what's what. Determination emanated from his face. Don't worry, Max. He hefted the rifle higher over his shoulder. Maggie knew he meant every word he had said to her when he promised to look out for her. As long as he stayed by her side, she felt safe. As they went back out to the truck and got in, Maggie thought again about telling Dave what she had seen before she ran into the police station. He'll think I'm crazy. She handed him the keys. He started the engine. As they rolled out of the parking lot, she decided to keep it to herself. If she saw anything like it again, she'd say so. Hopefully, if she ever saw anything like that again, she wouldn't be alone and then wouldn't have to feel like a complete panicked lunatic because there would be a witness. But she hoped she never saw that again. As he drove towards his parents' house, Dave thought about how soft Maggie's red hair had felt in his hands and against his skin. Red hair, he smiled. Red. The smile died. The cattle prodder. Why was there a cattle prodder in the police station? He debated whether or not to mention it to Maggie, but since he couldn't make any sense of it, he kept his mouth shut. It was darker now than when he went inside the station. The snow had stopped falling, but ice covered the roads and began to frost the edges of the windshield. The drive over to 810 Riverdale was short. Dave prayed as they approached. He hadn't been much of a religious man in his life, but after all that had happened since last night, he felt an almost bone-deep need for God. With all that was happening, he didn't know of anyone else to call on. He pulled into the circular drive and the tires crunched on the gravel. Bill Forrester, Dave's dad, never felt the need to pave the driveway when gravel did a perfectly good job. Right at this moment, Dave agreed. What with the snow and ice on the ground, gravel made for an easier surface to walk on. Linda Forrester often complained about the gravel since it needed so much upkeep to keep the ground covered properly. She also complained about having to walk on it in her Sunday heels. It had been an ongoing grumble between his dad and Mom for as long as Dave could remember. It always started the same way, too. Linda would walk out the front door of the ranch-style home with a covered dish in her hands for the luncheon after the sermon. The minute her Payless heels hit the gravel, she'd start her complaint. Damn, gravel! I'm going to break my neck one of these days, Bill. Bill Forrester would laugh, saying, Is that the language of a good church-going woman? Then Linda would shoot Bill a sour look. "That's the language of a woman you won't be sleeping next to tonight, William Forrester, unless you pave this driveway." Every Sunday. Dave knew the rhetoric by heart. It had become a long-standing joke between him and his dad. His dad would turn and look over into the back seat of their Buick at Dave and ask, "Think she'll go through with it this time, son?" Dave would smile ear to ear and say, "Yep, I think she means it this time, Dad." "You hear that, Linda? Now you've gone and got our son upset. We may have to start going to family counseling on Wednesday nights." Bill would shoot Linda a cheeky grin, and Linda would smack him on the arm. "The day I'm seen dragging my family into counseling in front of all those busybodies is the day pigs fly," she'd say. And all the way to church, Bill would tease Linda Forrester until she was all smiles again. Dave came out of his retrospection with a small smile on his face. He loved his parents. They were the best parents anyone could have ever asked for. Just as suddenly the smile died. He was afraid to go inside, afraid of what he might find or not find. Maggie watched as a parade of emotions marched across his face. She reached out and took his hand. Dave looked down at her hand on his. She had small hands, but the comfort was great. He gave her fingers a squeeze, then reached for the door. Maggie climbed out of the truck on his side, reluctant to let go of him. Together they approached the front porch, snow and gravel crunching under their shoes. Without thinking further, Dave used his spare key to the house. He didn't even bother to knock. He knew if his parents were home, they wouldn't mind. Maggie clutched the back of his jacket and held on, following him inside. "Mom? Dad?" Dave called out. No answer. Dave stood silently in the foyer, listening. "Hey, it's me," he tried again. Dave moved forward, taking slow steps into the living room. He looked around, but saw no one. "Should we check the rest of the house?" asked Maggie. "Yeah." Dave knew every inch of this house. He'd grown up here. His old room still had stuff from when he was in school, including his plaid bedspread and his Bon Jovi wall poster. "You can check the kitchen. I'll go check all the bedrooms." Maggie went off in the direction of the kitchen. Dave turned to make his way to the back hall. He checked his parents' room first. The bed was unmade, as if someone had been sleeping in it. On his dad's side, the covers were up, almost made up, but wrinkled as if something had been underneath. They were thrown back on his mom's side. At least there wasn't any blood from what he could tell, not like at Red's. Dave checked the bathroom and the closets. He walked back out to the hall and checked the middle bedroom. This room was more of a storage place for all his mom's crafts. No one was inside. Looking down the hall at his old room, Dave could see the corner of his old bed. He didn't think there would really be any reason to check that room since no one hardly ever went in there. He turned to go back towards the living room, then stopped. Something squeaked. It sounded almost like a mouse, but not quite. It came from his old room. Turning slowly, Dave took careful steps to the door. He looked inside and saw nothing. A breath. He heard a breath. Something was inside his room. "Find anything, Dave?" "Shh!" Dave shushed Maggie as she came up behind him in the hall. He reached behind him to indicate she should stay still. They listened. Maggie heard it then, a sound almost like someone panting. She looked at Dave. He put one finger over his lips to tell her to keep quiet. Slowly, Dave approached the room and looked around. Nothing. Another soft gasping sound. Dave looked at the closet. His dad's golf clubs were in the corner by the bedroom door. He grabbed a 9-iron and hefted it. Coming closer to the closet, he tightened his grip. Maggie's eyes were huge in her face. Dave reached toward the closet door. His hand hovered over the doorknob. Lightning quick, he pulled the door open, yelling at the same time, "Ah! Ah!" from Maggie. "Ah!" from inside the closet. Something small and gray moved further back. For an instant, Dave froze. "What the hell? Mom!" Dave saw his mother curled up in the corner of his closet, scared out of her wits. "Mom, it's me! Mom! Mom! Oh, God!" Dave dropped the 9-iron and sank down on his knees. He reached for his mother. Is it really you?" Linda Forrester was crying hysterically. She clamped both hands on either side of her son's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's me, Mom. It's me. I'm so sorry." They held each other tight. Linda Forrester's gray head rested on her son's steady shoulder. She didn't want to let go. "Where's Dad, Mom?" Linda tilted her head up to look at her son. They took him. Her eyes seemed haunted. Her chin shook as new tears fell. Dave looked at his mother's ash-white face. Who took him? What are you talking about? I don't know. I don't know what they are. She started crying again. Maggie, can you get a washcloth from the bathroom? Sure. Maggie went down the hall and found a wash rag. She held it under the warm water until it was good and wet, then wrung it out. She came back quickly to the room. Here, she said, handing it to Dave. Dave gently patted his mother's tear-stained cheeks with the cloth. Finally, Linda got hold of herself. Better, Mom? Linda shook her head in the affirmative. Now, who took Dad? Just take your time. She took a deep breath. I don't know what they were, son. It happened so fast, I barely got a glimpse. So dark, so dark. I just couldn't see right, but they took Bill. They took my Bill. When, Mama? Dave waited for his mother to continue. Maggie sat down behind Dave on his old bed. She was staring in shock at Dave's mom. What she saw flash across the sky and go through that store's wall earlier was making what Dave's mom said more frightening. Looking tired, Linda answered, Last night. I think it might have been around 3 o'clock a.m., but I'm not sure. We were asleep. Something really bright lit up the room. I remember thinking, why is it so bright? I opened my eyes and I saw Bill floating, David. He was floating up off the bed. I remember I reached up for his hand, but then I saw the shadows. There were shadows all around the bed. I couldn't make out the faces, but they were there. I knew they were staring at me. I screamed. I just screamed and screamed for Bill. He never woke up. He just went right through the ceiling. It's like he passed right through it like air. Dave stared at his mom as if she had lost her mind. He looked over his shoulder at Maggie, who looked back at him wide-eyed. Don't you get that look on your face, David Allen Forrester. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. Now, Mama, said Dave, patting his mother's hand. I know you believe what you're saying. I believe you, Mrs. Forrester, said Maggie simply. What? Dave turned to look at Maggie again. She turned to look back at him. I believe her, Dave. The two women looked at each other in silence. What do you mean you believe her? People just don't float away, Maggie. Dave, I saw something when you were inside the police station. Maggie described what she had seen streaking across the sky. She told him about the shadows and the one that passed through the 7-Eleven's wall. She didn't leave out any details. That's why I came running inside, she ended. Dave ran a hand through his hair, knocking his cap off. It sat on the floor while he looked down at it. He thought back to what had happened the night before, the bright light, blacking out, waking up in the ditch with the frozen ground around him. He didn't want to share this with the women. He was afraid it would scare them more. Hell, he thought, it scares the shit out of me. Son, I'm not crazy. Your dad, he floated right up and away. After he was gone, those shadows, they all disappeared, all except one. Linda took a deep breath. The one that stayed behind, I could feel it staring at me. It smelled something awful, kind of sulfuric. She wrinkled her nose. It came closer to my side of the bed, but I jumped off and ran in here. I've been in the closet ever since until you came. Fresh tears began to fall. Maggie slid down to the floor and wrapped her arms around Dave's mom. The two women held each other. Dave stood up and paced. He looked out the window, noticing the sun was going down already. It was barely 5 p.m. Usually, in the summer, it stayed light until around 8 p.m., but today, the sun was setting early. It was like someone had dialed the seasons forward to winter. Linda wiped her face with the cloth. I'm so cold, so very cold. For the first time, Dave noticed his mom was wearing a summer nightgown. Well, no wonder. You'll need to put on something warmer, Mom. It's been snowing outside and it's about 20 degrees. What? Linda stood up and looked out the bedroom window. Her jaw dropped and her mouth fell wide open. She turned and looked at Dave and Maggie, noticing their jackets for the first time. Maggie took Linda's hand. Let's go find you something warmer to put on. Then maybe we could go into the kitchen and fix something to eat while we try to figure this all out? She looked at Dave, who nodded his head. Maggie's stomach started to grumble. She remembered that she was on her way to get some breakfast this morning when this all began. In the wake of all that had happened, She had forgotten her hunger. Now, inside the house, and with another human being making things seem slightly less worse, although they couldn't be termed better, she knew she needed to eat something. Plus, Dave's mom had been in that closet since last night. She ought to be hungry. They all needed to do something nice and normal like eating so they could figure out the next step. Over a simple dinner of chicken soup and ham sandwiches, Dave told his mom about finding no one in town except Maggie. He finally introduced them properly as he was brought up to do. Then, he told his mom about finding no one in the Hollywood video. He left out the weird way the clerk's clothes were laid out, about no one in the police station, and then finally he told her what he had found at Red's house. His mom cried when he told her about the blood. She had known Darryl all his life. He was like a second son to her. She asked if they had called anyone to come help. Maggie took over and explained about no cell phone signals and no answers on the landlines. Soon, they all lapsed into silence. "We should maybe try to get some sleep," said Linda. Dave looked up. Maggie yawned. Linda grabbed the dishes and took them into the kitchen, trying for some normalcy. The heater kicked on, warming the air. Dave had turned it on while she and his mom were in her room. It smelled funny, like all heaters do when they're first turned on for the winter. "Okay," said Dave. "Where are we all going to sleep so I can help you get stuff settled?" Linda looked down into the sink. "I can't sleep in there. I can't go back in that bed tonight, son." Dave wasn't crazy about the idea either. The bed in his old room was a queen bed. "You and Maggie can sleep in my room. It's big enough for the two of you." "What about you?" asked Maggie. She looked somewhat apprehensive. Dave recognized the look of fear in her eyes. "If you ladies don't mind, I'll just make a bed on the floor with some comforters so I can keep an eye on you all." No one wanted to admit that the idea of being separated was terrifying. Everyone agreed. Together they made a thick bedding with some of his mom's old comforters. He dragged a couple of extra pillows out of the hall closet. Maggie borrowed a pair of Linda's sweatpants and a t-shirt. Dave foraged around in his dad's drawers for a pair of jogging pants and a t-shirt as well. Linda stayed in her peach velveteen lounge suit. She didn't want to change again. Once the women were settled in the bed, Dave checked all the locks in the house, then turned off the light and crawled into his makeshift bed. He kept the 9-iron next to him just in case. All three lay in the silence, tired but unable to fall asleep. It took some time, but one by one they dropped off into a light sleep. A dog was barking somewhere in the distance. Dave turned and saw row after row of corn in the moonlight. He was standing in the middle of the cornfield trying to find the dog. The snapping of a stalk behind him made him turn quickly. Sweat trickled down his forehead. A dark shape walked out of the corn and into the path of the moonlight. Dave knew him immediately. "Dad?" Dave took 2 steps toward his father, who didn't seem to recognize his own son. "Dad, it's me, it's Dave." He reached out his hand. Bill Forrester stared blankly down at the hand extended to him. Terror filled his eyes, which rolled around in their sockets, and he opened his mouth to scream. No sound emerged. Dave ran toward his father, who stepped back into the corn. He lost sight of his dad, but could see the stalks bending from someone pushing them aside to get through. It was so hot in the corn. Dave felt a small breeze brush the back of his neck, followed by the scent of fetid sulfur. He looked over his shoulder. 3 dark shadows were coming up fast behind him. A feeling of horror overtook him and he ran. He ran so far and so fast he got lost in the corn, unable to find his way out. Clouds passed over the moon, blocking out what little light there was to see by. Darkness began to cover Dave like dirt on a grave, smothering him, driving the air from his lungs. Dave sat up wide-eyed and stared around the room, a scream stuck in the back of his throat, choking him. Moonlight beamed weakly through the sheer shades, offering enough light to see that he was still in his old room. On the bed, his mom and Maggie slept on, not having heard the shout that had died so quickly before he could let it out. His mouth felt dry, and his heart was pounding. Dave reached up to run his fingers through his hair, and his hand came away damp. He was sweaty from head to toe. He realized it had been a dream. He had never had a nightmare like that before, so real, so vivid. Lying back down, he looked up at the ceiling, remembering his mom's words about his dad's disappearance. He went right through the ceiling. What did that mean? Shit! What the hell is happening? Dave looked over his head at the two sleeping women. He knew he would have to keep it together for them. His mom was everything to him, and Maggie was fast becoming very important to him as well. There was no way he was going to let anything happen to them. He just didn't know how he would be able to manage that, not knowing what he was up against. Tomorrow, they would drive out of Farley and head towards Tulsa. Maybe what was going on here was only here. He didn't know. What he did know was that they needed to find out, fast. He felt a little better having decided on a plan. It wasn't much of one, but it was better than nothing. Dave closed his eyes and dozed with both hands clutching the 9-iron. Chapter 6. Dave, Maggie, and Linda set off in Dave's Chevy. It was cramped with the three of them in the cab, but his mother's car sat too low and the tires were going bald. The truck offered a higher ride and good treads to deal with the slick roads. Although the snow had stopped, the temperature was still cold enough to keep the ice on the ground. Without a radio or a television to confirm the weather, it was hard to know exactly how cold it was. Dave borrowed one of his dad's flannel shirts to put over a long-sleeved polo. With the leather isotoners keeping his hands warm, the combination of layers with his jean jacket offered more protection from the cold. Maggie layered up, too, with a green sweater of his mom's over one of his dad's white Hanes t-shirts. His mom lent her a knit cap and scarf and a pair of gloves. Together, they set out to drive the hour-and-a-half northeast to Tulsa. Dave drove north out of Farley and got on OK 48 North. They were quiet in the truck. His mom had been shocked as they drove through town and saw absolutely no one milling around. She insisted they stop at the Quick Mart for road snacks. No one was inside to protest the armful of chips, jerky, water, and sodas they took. Dave tried the gas pump. It worked. He topped off his tank just to be on the safe side. While the gals picked out food, he grabbed a couple of flashlights, some batteries, some Quaker State oil just in case, a bag of cat litter for traction, and a couple of cans of inflatable flat fixer. You never know what can happen out on the road, and with no one around to call, it was better to be safe than sorry. He threw the bag of supplies in the toolbox in the bed of the truck next to the extra blankets his mom insisted on bringing along. He looked over at her walking out of the store next to Maggie. She looked 10 years older than she had just last week when he had gone over for dinner. Her eyes seemed vacant, haunted. It broke his heart. He slid his gaze right and caught Maggie watching him. Their eyes locked. His promised protection at all cost. Hers showed complete trust in him. "You ladies ready?" he said, reaching for the door handle to let them in. "As ready as we're likely to be, I guess," Maggie replied. She hopped in the middle, being the smallest of the three. "Mom," Dave said quietly. Linda looked up at her son. She placed a hand on his cheek. "I'm okay, David." She gave him a quick kiss on the cheek where her hand had been. Dave wrapped his arms around his mom and gave her a tight hug. He kissed her head, then pulled back. He helped her in, latched her seatbelt like one would do for a child, and closed the door. He walked around to the driver's side and got in. In moments, they were heading up 48. The gray sky seemed to be promising more snow, but not for several hours yet. 10 minutes into the drive, they passed up several abandoned cars that were parked oddly off the side of the road. One red Toyota had careened into a brown SUV on the opposite side of the road. No one was inside any of the vehicles. They passed more of the same over the next 30 minutes. "What's that? Up ahead?" Maggie was pointing excitedly out the windshield. Dave squinted. Sure enough, up ahead there were some figures walking slowly across the road. As they got closer, he slowed down. "They're cows," said Linda. Dave stopped when he got up to them. About 20 cows were milling around and across OK 48. The heifers were filthy from the bottom of their bellies down to their hooves. Dave put the truck in park and stepped out. He needed to shoo them off the road to get by. As he approached, waving his arms, he smelled the odor of manure. The filth on the cows was manure. "Hey-ya!" he shouted, shooing them off the road. The cows lowed and shuffled to the other side of the road. Several found some dry grass shooting up from the snow and began to chew. Dave climbed back inside the warm cab. "They're Feedlot cows. See the manure all over their feet? Cows from feedlots get real dirty like that. They're packed in so tight they end up standing around in their feces. That's disgusting. Maggie wrinkled up her nose. That's life, said Linda sadly, turning away. Dave put the truck in gear and steered slowly around the cows. About a mile down the road, a feedlot could be seen off to the right, maybe 600 to 700 feet from the main road. It was the same one Dave's FFA class had visited all those years ago. There it is, Dave pointed out. Everyone turned to look. Just then, a bright light streaked across the sky and came to a stop over the feedlot. Dave slammed on the brakes. They all jerked forward. "What the hell?" Maggie shouted. "Oh, no, 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 no." Linda covered her mouth with her hands, turning white. The light took on the vague shape of a large oval, its silvery surface reflecting the gray storm clouds. It almost blended right in except for the glow around it. A stream of light shot down into the feedlot beyond a large industrial building. Just as suddenly, the light retreated and the oval glowed blindingly bright as it shot up into the clouds, disappearing. "Fuck!" Dave sat there with a stunned expression on his face. Fear suffused his entire being along with a strong curiosity. The three of them looked at each other. Linda's face was covered in tears. Maggie was shivering inside her coat, and Dave struggled with what to do, what to say. Knowing what Maggie had seen to be true now, it wasn't much of a step further to believe his mom's story. Still, he didn't want to think about it. The thought that people could be beamed up through a ceiling and carted off was more than his brain could comprehend. One thought broke through all the others. Dad. Mom said Dad had been taken. Was it possible he was out there, somewhere in that feedlot? Was anyone else out there? Just the thought of one single person out in the field cemented it for Dave. He knew he'd have to go check it out. Fuck it! Running his hand over his mouth, Dave looked at Maggie and his mom. Someone could be out there. Dad! He let the possibility sink in. "You can't go out there. You don't know what's there," said Linda. She was thinking only of the fact that Dave was her only child, all that she had left right now. Maggie looked thoughtful. Looking around, she spied the overpass up ahead. "We could park under the overpass. It would give us some cover." Dave looked in the direction she indicated. "We park there and walk up through that cornfield. It's tall enough that we won't be seen. We could get close enough to just look, see if anyone is there," she said. "No," his mom protested. Maggie took Linda's hand. "We'll be together. It will be okay. Look." She indicated all around them with her hands. "No one is around right now. You saw how fast it came in. We won't be able to outrun it if it comes back," Linda pointed out logically. "What the hell are we going to do if it sees us?" "It won't see you, that is," said Dave. "Because you're not going. I'll go. I can run faster than both of you. I'm stronger. I'll keep low. If there's any hint of a light in the sky, I'll hit the ground and stay put until it passes." "Damn it, son! I forbid you to go." Linda began to cry again, but her voice held still. "Mama, it'll be all right, I promise." Dave put his hand over the clasped hands of his mom and Maggie. He looked at Maggie. "You'll stay with her, Mags. I need you to stay here with her." Maggie saw the determined look in his blue eyes. She nodded. Dave drove up and under the overpass. He parked on the shoulder and handed the keys to Maggie. He stepped outside of the truck and turned around, doing a brief survey of the area. It was cold. The wind had picked up. Maggie stepped out behind him. She placed her hand on his arm. "I should be back in about 20 minutes, no matter what I see. If there's anyone there, I'll come back first to tell you, then we'll decide what to do." What do I do if you're not back in 20 minutes? Her voice wobbled over the last few words. Dave placed his hands on either side of her face. "You get the hell out of here. Drive to Tulsa and find help." "But what about you?" she sniffled. "Don't you worry about that. If I'm not back in time, it's because I'm staying low. I won't get hurt." "How do you know that?" Maggie's voice showed frustration. Dave didn't know, but he wasn't going to let her in on that piece of information. He didn't want her any more scared than she already was. "Because I know, Mags. Promise me that no matter what, you'll get you and Mom out of here. Promise me, Maggie." His steady blue gaze begged her to say the words, make the promise. "I promise." Maggie sighed the words past her cold lips. No sooner had she spoken them when Dave's lips came down hard and hot on her own. He kissed her with more passion than she had ever felt in one single kiss in her entire life. She hadn't even felt this kind of heat with Brad. The desperate nature of their situation created a fierce need inside of them that defied all other feelings at that moment. Ahem. Dave's mom cleared her throat. Pulling apart, Dave dropped one last tender kiss on Maggie's swollen lips. He helped her back inside the truck, then walked around to the passenger side. Linda unrolled the window. In a raw and worried voice, she said, "Be careful, David." She kissed his forehead. "I will, Mom. Don't worry. I'll be right back. Just stay put." Dave chose not to tell his mom about the promise he had secured from Maggie. He trusted her to do what he asked to save them both. Dave kissed his mom on the cheek and backed up. She rolled up the window. He turned and went to the toolbox. He reached in and grabbed his flashlight just in case. He walked to the opening of the overpass and stopped. He looked around before trotting off quickly into the cornfield. Visions of his nightmare from the night before began to plague him. Dave prayed. Chapter 7. Inside the cab, Maggie watched as Dave disappeared around the corner. She had a bad feeling about this, but didn't know what else to do except wait. "He likes you," Linda said as she watched her son in the rearview mirror. In a split second he was gone, and her heart skipped a beat. Maggie didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. "I remember when Bill and I first met. He used to tease me something awful. I couldn't stand him at first, but after a while he grew on me. He sat behind me in biology. I remember Mrs. Bailey had us dissecting frogs, and Bill picked his up and made it dance. He kept trying to make me touch it, but all I could do was scream. I hate those nasty little suckers. The smell of formaldehyde makes me sick." Linda chuckled to herself. "His sense of humor didn't end once we were married either. On our honeymoon, I was so gosh dang nervous, all Bill could think to do was try and make me laugh. 'Hey, Lindy, look!' I looked up and there he was, naked as a jaybird, jumping around making it dance." Maggie opened her mouth in shock and choked back a laugh. "He said, 'Go on, Lindy, touch it. Remember the frog? You can call him Kermit.' He looked so damn ridiculous I nearly peed myself laughing." Linda smiled through tears when she saw Maggie smothering a laugh. With a raw voice, she continued, "But it worked. I forgot about how nervous I was, and everything was all right from then on." Maggie finally lost control and let out a peal of laughter. Linda reached her arm around Maggie's shoulders and laughed with her. "See, even now Bill can still work a room." "You love him very much, don't you?" asked Maggie softly. "Yes, I love him very much." Linda's voice ended on a whisper. It grew quiet inside the cab. The only sound came from the wind outside. The clouds were getting thicker. It would snow again before long. They really needed to get going. Maggie wondered where Dave was and if he was okay. "I loved my fiancée," said Maggie. Linda looked at the red-haired girl. She was really lovely. Her son couldn't have picked a prettier one if he tried. She made Sherry look like ditch water. "You have a fiancé?" "Had. He died 3 weeks ago." "What happened?" Linda was curious, but felt the need to be delicate. "Car accident. Brad was on his way home. A big rig ran right into him. The driver had fallen asleep at the wheel." Maggie looked down at her hands. She no longer wore her engagement ring, and she felt her hand looked odd without it. "I'm sorry, honey." "That's how I came to be here. After the funeral, I sort of ran away. I've been just going from one town to the next, drinking his memory away." Maggie didn't say this last out loud. She didn't want Dave's mom to think badly of her. "Well, God sure has some mysterious ways," said Linda before they both lapsed back into silence. Both women resumed checking the rearview mirrors for signs of Dave. "Shit on a stick, it's cold," Dave thought. He pushed carefully through the stalks of corn. Some still had a little green on them, but most were dead or dying, turning brown from the frost and snow. He could just barely make out the grain silo up ahead. Next to it was the feedlot. A waft of something foul passed his nose. "Jesus, that reeks!" The smell grew stronger with every step he took closer. It was rotten, fetid and mixed with a sulfuric rotten egg smell. Dave pulled his shirt up over his nose, trying to block out the odor. It was really disgusting. You'd expect to smell manure at a feedlot, but this wasn't manure. It smelled like death. When he got to the edge of the field, he stopped and looked around. Dave tilted his head up to check the sky for any signs of bright lights. Nothing. He looked all around the grain silo and the building for any sign of people or, God forbid, shadows. He didn't see anything. The pens were just beyond the industrial building. He'd have to get up to it and around to see if anything was on the other side. Taking a deep breath, Dave put his head down and ran as fast as he could across the open stretch. When he got to the back of the building, he dropped down low. Dave kept his back to the building and looked left and right. The wind howled now and tugged at his hat. He pulled the collar up on his jacket. He duck-walked slowly to the end of the building and peered around. Up the alley between the silo and the building, there was an open area. Dave could see beyond to the cow pens. The smell was overwhelming and he gagged a little. Something was moving around in the pens. Probably cows, he thought, like the ones on the road back there. The weird thing was the silence. He didn't hear a single moo. He inched closer. One step at a time brought him nearer to the possibility of discovery. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back and disappear into the crack of his ass. The wind cooled it quickly. Dave came up behind an old water pump. He stopped. The sound of machinery starting up made him freeze in place. Off to the left, a feed chute began cranking. The movement in the pens increased and seemed to be heading toward the troughs under the end of the chute. Dave felt a combination of fear and hope. The starting up of the machinery could mean people were around, but after what he had seen fly over and hover above the lot, he wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. Dave debated whether or not to go a little further in. It seemed that only one reason mattered here: Dad. Pulling his cap low, he inched around the old water pump and got closer to the far end of the building. He made it to the corner and stopped. The smell coming from the direction of the feed chute was making his eyes water and his throat gag. He looked at the mush that was dropping out and into the troughs. It was dark red and lumpy. Fucking gross. As Dave tried to figure out what was being fed to these cows, he suddenly realized they weren't cows. Pink, flesh-colored skin caught his eyes, which widened in horror. People! Bare-assed, naked people were pushing each other aside to get to the troughs. They were stuffing the putrid feed into their mouths, gorging. Dark red liquid ran down their hands and faces, soaking their bodies, but that wasn't what scared him the most. It was their eyes. Their eyes were bulging out of their sockets, looking vacant, looking like they saw nothing. They bumped into each other, so tightly packed together as they were. Another chute, one that extended from the grain silo, moved usually on an automated timer to shift and pour corn into the vat. The vat was attached to another building. The vat churned and pumped out more mush to the feed chute. Several of the people were trampled underfoot. They lay there in human waste, groaning. The stench was killing Dave, but he couldn't turn his eyes away. As he watched from the protection of the corner, dark shadows drifted toward the sides of the pens. They were tall, well over 8 feet. The description of a shadow had been fairly accurate after all. These dark, amorphous shapes lacked distinction and changed as they moved. The smell of sulfur mixed with the rotten, sickening smell of death surrounded them. The shadows pointed in the direction of the trampled bodies. A bright light engulfed the dead and dying forms, lifting them up and out of the pens. They floated above the heads of the others who didn't seem to notice. One by one, the bodies were dropped into the vat. The vat continued to churn. Dark red, lumpy gristle continued to come out of the feed chutes. Vacant-eyed humans continued to gorge on the slop. The cycle continued before his horrified eyes. Dave now understood that the dark red slop was blood. The lumps, corn, and body parts. The putrid smell was ground-up bodies. It was a death camp. People were being exterminated one by one, grotesquely, painfully. This is what had happened to his dad. This is what had happened to Red. It's what had happened to everyone except for him, Maggie, and his mom. Tears fell down Dave's face. Holy Mother of God, protect us, please. I don't know what to do. Dave started to back up. He knew he needed to keep low, Something small caught his eye. In the far corner of the closest pen, a small child huddled down in the muck. All the other people were over by the troughs, but this tiny little boy, who looked to be all of 4 years of age, was trying to stay low and hide. His small face was covered in wet tears. His eyes looked around him wildly, but they weren't vacant. Shit! Dave looked to see where the shadows had gone. He didn't see them. He looked up, left, right, behind him. He was starting to feel paranoia overtake him. I can't leave him. I can't leave a kid in there. Dave knew he'd have to come out from behind the corner to get to the little boy. He didn't like that at all. He remembered the heavy-duty flashlight in his hand. He gripped it tighter. Don't know if it'll help or not. Can you hit a shadow? He thought wildly, trying to come up with a plan. There wasn't any time to formulate a good one. The people were starting to slow down on their feeding. Some had sat back down in the filth. Lord, if you can hear me, please help me get us all out of here safely. He's just a little boy. Please, Lord. Dave whispered his prayer heavenward. Lastly, he prayed for Godspeed before he dashed out and across the open lane to the fence line. He didn't stop, running down the fence to the corner and around to the other side. The little boy spotted him as he ran up to the far corner where he sat. He stopped crying and reached his little arms up. Dave skidded to a halt, reached between the posts and pulled the little guy through sideways. He didn't even stop and wonder how he got the strength to manually flip the kid and slide him through the beams of wood. The tot clung to Dave like a monkey. Dave wrapped his arms around him and retraced his path back to the corner where he had been hiding. He was breathing hard from the sprint. Once they got to the side of the building, Dave tried wrapping his coat around the little boy to keep him as warm as possible for the run back through the cornfield. He didn't have to worry about telling the boy to hang on, because he was nearly strangling Dave's neck. Hey, kid, I need you to be really quiet, okay? The boy lifted his brown eyes and looked at Dave. He nodded his head and then tucked it back under Dave's chin. The first few flakes of snow that had been threatening to fall from the storm-darkened clouds landed on top of the child's head. Dave bent as low as he could with his new burden and inched his way along to the backside of the building. The open area between the building and the edge of the cornfield was clear. Without hesitating another moment, Dave took off at a run, slipping once, but he righted himself with his free hand and kept on running. He slipped through the first few rows of corn until he felt covered, then he slowed his pace. He didn't want to cause too much of a disturbance in the stalks and draw attention to them. Halfway through the field, Dave looked up and saw a light streaking toward them. He hit the ground fast and bent his body over the little boy. Bright light lit up the field. It slowed and hovered over them. Shit! God damn it! The light grew brighter and the smell of sulfur began to fill the space created by the light. Dave didn't want to look up. He kept his head down, praying, trying to protect the boy. Stand! Dave heard a deep, guttural voice, loud and clear, but he was sure it was inside his head and not actually spoken. Fear gripped him as he uncurled his body and slowly stood up. Between the stench on the little boy from the filthy cow pen and the permeating odor of sulfur, Dave began to feel nauseous. He looked in the direction he felt the voice had come from and saw 3 dark shadows blot out the light as they came toward him. He wrapped both arms tighter around the kid. His knees threatened to buckle, but Dave stood tall, ready to fight if he had to. What the hell do you want? Why are you here? Dave's low voice carried an edge of steel that he had never felt the need for before in his entire life. Judgment! 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 The guttural voice boomed inside his head and bounced around, fading off into a distant echo. What do you mean, judgment? What the fuck does that mean? Dave tried to back up slowly, but 2 more shadows came up behind him. He stopped. The little boy whimpered. Pain, life, respect, kill. Pain, life, respect, kill. These words repeated and reverberated inside Dave's skull, escalating in their volume and intensity. He tucked his chin down over the child's head, wanting to cover his ears, but knowing he couldn't let go of the boy. It hurt. The words rubbed against the soft tissue of his brain like sandpaper. Stop! Jesus, stop! Please stop! Dave begged for them to stop speaking in his head. His eyes reflected his anguish and an increasing anger. He pushed past the pain to speak. Listen! He's just a little boy. He doesn't understand. Just let him go, please. The shadow in the center drew closer until Dave could feel its putrid breath fanning over his skin. He closed his mouth and tried not to breathe. It reached toward them and hovered over their heads. Dave felt his heart pounding, his lungs bursting, needing air, and his chest constricting. In one huge gasp, he sucked in much-needed air and choked on the grainy sulfuric taste that hit his tongue. It was getting to be too much. He knew he was going to pass out soon. One word registered in his head before darkness overtook him. Change. The world went black. Chapter 8. Dave! Oh, God, Dave! Something was slapping him hard across the face. Dave swam to consciousness through murky waters. It was beating him. It was killing him. He swung out, fighting for dear life. The damn thing was trying to kill him. David! Son! Stop! Stop! He heard his mother's voice and opened his eyes. He looked around him. His mom was standing to his right, holding the boy who was now wrapped in a blanket. He looked down and saw that his hands were grasping the front of Maggie's jacket, while her small hands tried to restrain his wrists. Dave, it's okay. Relax. Maggie's voice was soothing. It felt like cool water running over heated skin. He inhaled. All he could smell now was cool, crisp air, and Maggie. He reached out and engulfed her in a tight embrace. The lavender scent of her soap was so sweet, he never wanted to breathe anything else again. We have to get out of here, he said finally. He got up quickly, extending his hand to Maggie and pulling her up alongside him. Who's this? Linda asked. Dave ran his hands over his scalp, remembering the pain, the warning. He felt overly anxious, knowing they needed to get out of there now. I don't exactly know, Mom, replied Dave. Hey, buddy, what's your name? He asked, sounding out of breath. Billy, came the soft reply. Billy's big brown eyes stared with curiosity at Maggie. Maggie couldn't resist his inspection and put her arms out. Billy went right into them. Did you hear that, son? His name is Billy, just like your father. Linda Forrester's eyes welled up with tears. She turned to Dave. What happened? What did you find? Dave didn't know how to answer her. He didn't think he could ever bring himself to tell her what had happened to her husband, his dad, everyone. Let's just get to the truck. He ushered them toward the road. He put his arm around Maggie and took his mother's hand. I thought I told you to leave if I didn't get back in 20 minutes, he whispered in Maggie's ear. Did you honestly think I'd leave you? She looked up at him. Dave tried to hide a smile of gratitude. He was happy she was still here, but was also concerned that she and his mom could have been hauled off to the feedlot. Still could be if they didn't get the hell out of here. He kissed the top of her head and said nothing. When they reached the truck, they piled inside without a word. Maggie sat in the middle holding Billy. Dave took off slowly down the road heading for Tulsa through the falling snow. In the rearview mirror, he could see bright lights leaving the lot one after the other. When the last one ascended, the silo exploded and the feedlot burst into flames. Everyone turned around at the sound of the explosion. Silently, Dave said a prayer for all those who had just met with a fiery death. He didn't know if he could ever tell Mom and Maggie what he had seen, what he had witnessed. Maybe it was better to keep it from them. Maybe, if he hid it deep down inside him, he could sleep at night. Maybe someday, they'd all be able to sleep at night again. Dave drove on. No one spoke. An hour down the road, somewhere along I-44, bright lights were heading for them coming from Tulsa. Dave flinched and pulled off to the side of the road. As they got closer, one large light turned into two headlights. Headlights! They were headlights. Everyone held their breath as the car pulled up beside them. Each driver exited their vehicle slowly, walked to the middle of the road, and reached out to shake each other's hand. Some small relief and no small amount of hope welled within the hearts of those meeting in the middle of the highway. Stories were exchanged, stories that matched in almost every detail except for location. People disappearing, shadows, empty clothes, bloodstains, stray cattle, explosions at local feedlots, very few survivors. Dave listened to the other driver talking with Maggie and his mom. He watched as they foraged around for some clothes in the back of their trunk that might fit Billy. They now knew that no matter where they decided to go, they would have to begin again. As the last of the fading day died away into the snowy night, one word echoed inside Dave Forrester's mind, reminding him why they were still here. Change. The end? Or is it the beginning? This has been Harvest by Michelle E. Gwynn. This book was narrated by Ron Phillips and recorded at Pinnacle Studios. Copyright 2014 by Michelle E. Gwynn. Production copyright 2014 by Pinnacle Studios and Michelle E. Gwynn.